Okay, hello YouTube. Today we're going to be covering the Najdorf Sicilian. After e4, c5, knight f3, d6, d4, c d4, knight d4, knight f6, knight c3, a6 begins what we call the Najdorf Sicilian. And today we're going to be specifically looking at a very particular line. We're going to be looking at a line called the Amsterdam variation, which begins with pawn to f4, which is actually a line that I did not cover in my introduction to the Najdorf Sicilian. So if you like content like this and you want to see more of it, please go ahead and click on that subscribe button and click on your notification icon. Now what's interesting about f4 is if you look at other lines, like if you look at bishop e2, or if you look at bishop e3, like the mainline classical or the mainline English attack, you kind of have an option as black as to whether you're going to play e6 or e5. You can kind of choose either one of these setups. But against pawn to f4, just about every single strong player universally plays the move e5. And it's kind of weird. It almost seems a little anti-instinctual. Like, why are we all universally playing the move pawn to e5? What's the reason behind this? And it's a little complicated, so I'll try to explain, but I'm going to have to explain it by showing you other variations and by just trying to explain kind of the basic dynamics of what's going on in these positions with both black and white, and why playing pawn to f4 early isn't exactly saving a tempo. So for starters, one thing that you have to understand is you're not really saving any kind of tempo by playing pawn to f4 early unless you decide that you're never ever going to move the bishop on c1. So that's kind of one of the ideas, is that white's saying, hey, if you play e5 and later you play e takes f4, I'm gaining a tempo because my bishop will only have to make one move. Well, if you can find useful moves other than moving your bishop from c1 to e3, that's certainly true. But the problem in this position is that black's position really is statically better than white's position. And what that means in very simplified terms, and this is what Garry Kasparov said was a shortcut to figure out if your position is statically better. Black can improve his position indefinitely. Black has basically an indefinite number of waiting moves that make logical sense. Like he has bishop e7, he has b5, he has bishop e6, he has castles, rook e8, rook c8, queen c7. He can just improve pretty much indefinitely. He can just keep putting his pieces on better squares, and then once all his pieces get on better squares, he can then decide if he wants to take on f4 or wants to play a move like pawn to d5 and just improve his position further. So because of this, white's waiting moves, if he doesn't play the move bishop e3 at some point anyway, white's waiting moves start becoming really, really contrived. And more importantly, white has better early moves to make than the move pawn to f4. He would like to play something like bishop e2, bishop e3, and then play a4, and then get ready to put that knight on d5 to try to make black's improvements a little less obvious and a little less simple. So, again, to understand why players universally play e5 against f4, we have to understand a little bit about what they're trying to accomplish, like what tempos are they trying to gain. So we have to take a look at the classical variation with bishop e2, e5, knight b3. So in this case, the knight ends up going to b3 because it doesn't want to get on f3 and step in the way of the f-pawn. So the argument with the Amsterdam variation is that the knight is just better on f3 and we'd rather play f4 and then tuck the knight behind. This just doesn't seem to hold a lot of water, just because it's not a very good idea to play this early f4. So in the main line, we're going to play bishop e7, we're going to castle, and then let's say we play an early f4 here. So this is nearly identical to the Amsterdam variation, except we haven't played the knight to f3, we've instead played the knight to b3. But again, in this case, black just has this wide array of waiting moves he continues to play. You can play b5, you're threatening b4 followed by knight takes e4, you're going to have to defend that somehow, so a3, bishop b7, again putting pressure on e4, we're going to have to defend it, bishop f3, knight on b to d7, we're going to follow up with rook c8, we can follow up with rook e8, knight b6, knight c5, just an indefinite number of waiting moves. Now here, white should really just give up the ghost and play something like bishop e3, but in this case, black is certainly better. Black can play rook c8, queen e2, queen c7, queen f2, and then eventually we can play takes, play knight e5, and this was just slight edge black, and this is what happened in Lindschuh versus De Firmian in Hamburg in 1997, and black actually had an advantage, and actually after a few more moves you can kind of see why. He just can improve his position really cleanly And you can just see everything is going perfectly here. He's threatening here, he's threatening to destroy pawns, he's threatening all kinds of stuff. Black's pieces are beautifully placed. So this is one of the things that happens in these f4 lines when the e5 and f4 pawns kind of face off. Eventually this exchange will happen, and you'll end up with kind of what we call corresponding weaknesses. White has a weakness on e4, and black has a weakness on d6, and these weaknesses basically level out. So the question is, who's going to be better in these situations once these pawns get exchanged? It's usually the person who's better developed. That's why these contrived setups, where white ends up playing an early f4 and makes this early tension, are kind of a bad idea for white. Because black can improve his position indefinitely, and he doesn't waste any time in development, whereas white, if white continues to make waiting moves, eventually his waiting moves, unless he plays bishop e3, are going to get really contrived. So an example would be, let's say instead of bishop e3, we play something like king h1, just to try to say we're not going to waste this tempo. We can continue to make really solid waiting moves, whereas white is stuck. King h1 was useful, but queen e1, queen g3, and now we're out of moves for white. White needs to do something, and he just doesn't have anything. So, I mean, he would practically have to play f takes e5 at this point, and then simply knight takes e5, and this position is simply slight edge black. Black has all of his pieces developed, and we have this corresponding weakness situation. And this is going to favor black, because black is the better developed here. And this is what white is really trying to avoid in the main lines by delaying pawn to f4. He doesn't create this tension until he knows that he can maintain a development lead, because he doesn't want this exchange happening without having enough solid development to back it up. So that's basically what's going on. And so if we look at the main line of this so-called Amsterdam variation, where we play the move pawn to f4, and we play this immediate e5, which again is pretty much universally played, this is almost like a cardinal sin here for white. White can play knight f3, and then we have to play the immediate knight on b to d7 to protect that e5 pawn. And now we're kind of running into the same difficulty. If we play the immediate bishop e3, we're certainly not gaining the tempo that we wanted to gain with pawn to f4. All we've done is change the location of our knight. We've said we think the knight is better on f3 than b3, and again, that's not clear that the knight is better on f3 than b3. So we've gained 0 tempo, but we've given black the option to open the position when it favors him the most. And he has that option to do that at any point. So like the best main line here is something like bishop e7, and then let's just say they continue developing with bishop e2. We would castle, castles, and then we would take when it favors us the most, because white hasn't had time to castle and then play king h1. So here, if he takes, we're just simply losing a pawn for nothing. So white needs to take that time to castle and play king h1, before he plays pawn to f4, so he's simply not losing that material, because black can pick the most favorable moment to exchange on f4 and create this situation. So the other way white can play this attack is he can try to, again, just find useful moves that delay the move bishop e3. So a4 makes a ton of sense in this case. We're trying to prevent black's expansion. But black actually still has an indefinite amount of expansion moves, because a little secret against a4, we can always play b6 to expand with b6 and bishop b7 instead of b5. So really, we're not even losing a tempo. Like really, if anything, white's lost a tempo by having to play a4. And if white continues with a5, usually b5 anyway is a really good response, because the worst white can do is take with en passant, and then we're still gaining that b7 score for our bishop. So a few examples. Let's say bishop e7, bishop c4 is certainly playable. Now, there's a couple games here. There's Smirin versus Van Forest, which just continued castles kingside. And then there's this older game. There's this Liko versus Garry Kasparov, played in Sarajevo in 1999, which ended in a draw, which continued with queen a5. So one of the things is, with queen a5, you don't... Okay, so it almost looks like he's playing queen a5, number one, to threaten knight takes e4, which of course he is. And number two, it looks like it kind of prevents, white from playing pawn to a5 himself. This is something you don't need to be afraid of. So for example, if castles and they were to play a5 question mark, we would play b5 takes, and then queen takes b6, cuts white's king off from castling, and black has a huge development lead. So after, say, knight d5 takes, bishop b7 takes, we're actually threatening to take the pawn on e4. White has 0 development and can't defend his position. So for example, queen e2, we could take. They can't even play bishop f4 because of queen b2. So again, we wait till the opportune moment and then we take. They would have to castle, and then we just start putting pressure on this e4 pawn, and white's position is pretty much indefensible here. This is just major advantage black. Black is up a pawn that he actually can't get back. Note that he would be able to get it back if this knight were on b3. So again, this is where it becomes really questionable if the knight is better placed on the f3 square, because in so many of these lines you'd actually rather have it on b3, especially when these pawns get exchanged, when the e5 pawn gets exchanged for the f4 pawn. So that would just be major advantage black. So in the Kasparov game, Kasparov played queen a5. That game continued queen e2, and then Kasparov castled, e takes f4, bishop takes f4, and after knight e5, this position is approximately level. Okay, so the reason the position is level is because we have the corresponding weaknesses, but in this case, nobody has a very clear advantage of development. Black hasn't finished his development with his last piece, and therefore white is doing okay here. So this position is approximately level, but black has certainly equalized and gotten a very good game. So the other way that this can get played is after bishop c4, we can of course just castle. This is my preference. I see no reason to play queen a5. And then say after castles, we're following this Smirin versus Van Forest game. We're just going to play b6, and we're just going to continue to improve our position indefinitely. And then we're going to do the same thing. We're going to try to pick that moment where we're to play e takes f4, and when we do play e takes f4 at the moment of our choosing, this position is simply going to be advantage black. So white feels kind of this obligation to play f captures e5, and in so doing, trying to mitigate some of the problems with improving his position with the white pieces and finishing his development. And that was in Smirin versus Van Forest. So in kind of conclusion, if you want to take a look at the move, if you want to take a look at this move after a6, pawn to f4, pretty much universally you should be replying with pawn to e5, and you should be following this basic plan of kind of indefinite improvement with black, where you're going to be playing moves like bishop e7, pawn to b5, or pawn to b6, followed by bishop to b7. That's another thing about the early commitment with pawn to f4 that you just want to note, is once the pawn gets kind of committed to f4, usually the bishop's location is better on b7 than it is on the e6 square, because this pawn can't move backwards and go to f3 and make the bishop bite on granite on b7. And that's another downside of playing this early pawn to f4. So anyways, I hope you found this video helpful. I hope you learned something new about chess, and I hope you can use a lot of these ideas in your own games. Thank you very much for watching.